We are now streaming live on YouTube, so I will go ahead and get started. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Black River Watershed Wednesday webinars. My name is Katie Malinowski, and I'm the Executive Director of the New York State Tug Hill Commission in Watertown. Welcome to all of you, especially if this is your first time attending the Black River Watershed Conference. We are looking forward to the day when we can hold this conference in person again. But for now, we're making the best of our remote meetings and webinar capability. As I mentioned at the beginning, this webinar is being recorded and will be shared via our YouTube channel and on our website. Follow-up emails from Zoom will contain some links for you, and we'll also be sharing those links in the chat. You are all muted, but use of the chat is encouraged. So your colleagues at the Tug Hill Commission, the Lewis, Hamilton, Herkimer, Jefferson, and Oneida County Soil and Water Conservation Districts, and the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation Region 6 have been working hard to put this series together for you, and we hope you find them both informative and interesting. Joining us today is our co-coordinator in this webinar series, Nichelle Swisher, the district manager from the Lewis County Soil and Water Conservation District. And I will now turn it right over to Nichelle. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Katie. Today, we're happy to bring you two very dynamic and knowledgeable presenters to our Watershed Conference. Mary Osterman is a Senior Extension Associate at the New York State Sea Grant, Cornell University, and Christopher Dotson is an Associate Director at Syracuse University's Environmental Finance Center. Mary's primary expertise is in community resilience with a focus on climate adaptation and floodplain management. She's available to meet with municipalities in the Great Lakes Basin to learn more about their needs in these related areas. I'll make a little note that in the chat there is a link to New York State Sea Grant if you're interested in learning more. Chris provides technical assistance to local governments on topics related to water, wastewater, and stormwater management, and provides training on topics such as infrastructure, funding and resiliency, leadership, management, and finance. And again, in the chat, you'll see a link to the Environmental Finance Center at ESF for more information. This fourth webinar will look at tools communities can use to help them adapt to extreme weather events and funding opportunities to support related planning and implementation projects. We'll also learn about other community experiences that can be replicated in the Black River and beyond. Participants will learn how to support local priority projects related to extreme weather events, as well as understand how other communities have made themselves more resilient in future events. At this point, I'll turn it over to Mary and Chris. Thank you.
Thanks, Nichelle, for the introduction and for the Tug Hill Commission and the Soil and Water Conservation Districts for hosting us. So today, Mary and I are going to talk about resiliency at the local level, particularly when it comes to extreme weather events. And so, you know, there's all types of resiliency. People will say my kids are resilient, and sometimes I think they are. But today, for today's conversation, we're really going to focus on this definition of resiliency. So it's the ability to respond and recover from disasters, and includes those inherent conditions that allow the system to absorb impacts and cope with an event, as well as post-event planning to reorganize, change, and learn in response to a threat. And so this threat could be drought, this threat could be flooding, it could be coastal inundation like we've had around Lake Ontario, it could be riverine in our streams and rivers down our steep mountain slopes during severe precipitation events. And a question that, you know, I've been in meetings where where folks use the chat an awful lot too. So I'm posing a question to you that's a hypothetical, so you don't have to answer, or rhetorical, so you don't have to answer it. But if you do, drop it into the chat. So you talk about resiliency or resilience in your day-to-day work life. If you do, we'd like to hear how. Mary, you can advance the slide. So whether you talk about resiliency or not, you know, one part of resiliency is actually proactive planning versus reactive planning. And I like to use the metaphor of like the way you own and operate and maintain your vehicle, your personal vehicle or your home. Do you wait for the roof to spring a leak to replace it, or do you replace it before that happens? Do you wait for your oil pan to dry out and your engine to seize up, or do you get routine maintenance, right? And so being able to plan for future events based on past and current conditions and also future scenario planning will help you be a more resilient community. Mary? So change is inevitable. Who would have known a year and a half ago that we'd all be sitting here in this forum using this format to communicate with each other, right? So change is inevitable. There's not much we can do to stem change. And so we just have to prepare for change, except for from a vending machine. And so when you're thinking about things, think about, what does your community look like today? What are the major industries, commercial, residential, agriculture, retail? What's the landscape like? What are the types of activities and amenities that are conducted within your community? And what's your demographic composition? And it's not just, African American, Caucasian, et cetera, but ages and income and education levels. Those things matter too. Different people make different lifestyle and behavior choices based on where they fit into our demographic, into demographic categories. And then think about, really think about what will your community look like in 30 years? It won't look like it did 30 years ago, and it probably won't look like it does today. And then what do you want it to look like? And who do you think will live in a community like that? And that's what you plan for. And that's also how you start looking at our extreme weather events and different kind of climate cycles that you want to mitigate for in order to plan for the community that of the future. And so another kind of rhetorical question, if you want to drop it into the chat box, please feel free to do so. What keeps you up at night when you're thinking about your community and your role serving your community at a regional or at the local level? And so when you're starting to think about how great the past was or how cool the future can be, keep in mind that this kind of 50s nuclear family, suburban, white picket fence idea that many of us hold of the prosperity from post-World War II was A, not afforded to everybody, and B, wasn't necessarily as happy and glamorous on the inside as it appeared on the out, right? So there were flaws in the past. So the past wasn't always better than the present, and it probably isn't going to be the future. And when you look at the future, the Jetsons, of course, Rosie was very grumpy and no one wants to live with Rosie. And, that was supposed to be the year 2020, right? And so that obviously isn't the world that we're living in today. Thanks, Mary. I'm ready to move forward. So some of the things that we've done in the past, the way that we've built community, the way that we've communicated with each other, having granges and kind of community halls that served as schools and churches and town halls all at once. These things don't exist in the way that they used to. Malls are another thing. I don't think many of you have a mall in your community, but who would have thought 20 years ago that a mall would be threatened and vulnerable? Mary. Oh, back one, please. Thanks. So, again, who would have known that malls would be vacating at the rate that they are? And it's because of the different lifestyle changes. People are ordering things online, and the pandemic has accelerated this trend. Folks like me who love going to shop in person, I haven't been able to do that as much this past year. So now I'm ordering things online and I'm finding that it's not that bad. And people who are younger than us order an awful lot of things online. This impacts our economy, this impacts behavior, it impacts traffic and communication and the ways that we all get together. And again, at the end of the day, it's all interrelated. So we're here talking about weather and severe weather impacts, but those things impact our social dynamics and our economic dynamics at the local level. Mary? So how do we plan for resiliency? There's a number of ways to do that. Here are a few. Resiliency plan, you can create a resiliency plan, but before you do that, you need to take a look at some of the other planning tools you may or may not have in your community, like zoning or having land use planning or agricultural planning, watershed planning, planning for your assets, etc. All of those pieces are components of what makes a community resilient and helps you build that resiliency plan. Thanks, Mary. And at the end of the day, the longer you wait to create a plan and start figuring out ways to fund it and implement it, the more expensive it gets, right? The longer you wait to do that home repair, the more expensive it's going to get. The materials become more expensive, the labor becomes more expensive, things may become, limited by supply and demand, and maybe the effect, the effect of waiting too long will also have caused that initial investment to have increased in cost. One more click. So literally, the longer you wait, the closer you get to the little poo emoji hitting the fan. And as an elected official, as a public servant, it's your job to do due diligence to make sure that you are a good steward of the funds that you raise from your ratepayers and taxpayers. Mary? So a few other resiliency considerations. Again, you want to look at the financial health of the municipality, because when you create a plan, you have to pay for the plan, and we'll talk about that. You have to pay for the recommendations that come from the plan, and we'll talk about that funding a little later too. But what is your financial health right now? And again, the metaphor of looking at your own personal life. You're planning for retirement. You're looking at your checking account, you're balancing your checkbook, you're figuring out how to pay for things that you want or need in a responsible way. And so when you're looking forward to taking a vacation at the end of the year, you're figuring out a way to pay for that, in a responsible way. And that's all we're asking folks to do at the municipal level too, is plan for something in the future and figure out ways to pay for it and make it happen. But you can't do that without also looking at your community's financial health. Again, looking at the demographics of your community. It's not what your taxpayers can afford to pay or are willing to pay, it's what they can afford to pay. How much investment can you actually expect coming from your locality versus looking for additional external funds? And then looking at your other environmental impacts, your water supply, where does it come from? And the impacts from those storms and drought and things like that may impact your infrastructure in negative ways. So I'm going to stop talking here and move it over to Mary so she can kick off with some of her slides.
Thanks, Chris. Sorry, I'm so trigger happy. It gets so glitchy. Sometimes it wants 2 pushes and sometimes 1.
It's all right.
Okay. So first poll question, we're going to give you guys about 10 seconds. And the poll should be coming up for you. The question is, what do you consider as the greatest weather threat to your community? And if you want to just pick from that list. Couple more seconds. Okay, and we're going to end the polling. So it looks like severe storms is what people are most concerned about. So we'll be talking about that, and then flood and drought as well. So this is a good thing to be thinking about as we continue through the presentation here. Okay, so talking about threats a little bit more, Chris has talked a little bit about some of the more social and demographic and financial aspects of resiliency. I'm going to focus on a lot more of these climate change and weather trends. So we'll broad brush this, but know if people have more in-depth questions, feel free to reach out and we'll get information to you. When we're talking about climate change and weather trends, what we're expected to see in our region of New York is really more severe storms more frequently, meaning, we may see these 2-inch rain events more frequently than we have been in the past. Also, changing precipitation patterns. So that really goes along with these temperature changes. So in the wintertime, will our precipitation be falling as snow or will that be rain? And depending on what that looks like before, that could have quick snow melt impact. So riverine flooding and ice jamming and things like that. Also, all of this impacts our water table, right, for the year. So that leads us to the questions of drought and impacts from that. The other things that we're seeing are changes in habitat shifts. So I am not a gardener per se, I dabble, but my mother is huge into her flower gardens. And she's finding that some species and varietals that didn't fare well even when I was a kid, she has them surviving in her flower bed. So there's opportunities to be thinking about as well, longer growing seasons and things like that. Now, all of these impacts are also impacting natural and built environments. So if we're thinking about changes in temperature in the wintertime, we're having more freeze-thaw cycles. And what does that do to our infrastructure? And then also impacts to human health. And this is one that I don't think that we necessarily think about maybe as much as we should. So just thinking about these warm stretches that we have in the summer, hot and humid weather, people with asthma, that's problematic. People in the springtime with allergies, I've heard a lot of people this year talking about how they haven't had allergies before, but this year things are really bothering them. So I do want to focus a little bit on drought. So in 2016, and this is something that many of you know much better than I do, but the town of Copenhagen, or the village of Copenhagen, was down from 3 wells to 1 well, and they were having to have water tanked in from neighboring communities. These are real things and real impacts that you all are facing. Again, in 2020, rainfall was down over a 6-month period by 6 inches from average. And because of that, there were families that were traveling up to 30 miles one way, 3 to 4 times a week, just to fill up water tanks for personal water use at their homes.
And this is when I focus on the social and cultural and economic aspects of these things, this hurts property values and it hurts people's, their quality of life.
Thanks, Chris. And on the flip side, talking about flood, flood, I think, seems to get a lot of press because it's so visual. And not to say that it's more important by any means than drought. So this was an actual flood event that occurred in the region in 2019. Some homes were surrounded. This is flooding from the Black River itself. Homes were surrounded by floodwaters. A farmer had this is a hay bale that is over 1,000 feet long that was displaced in floodwater, and he had to stake it down so that it didn't end up floating down the river. And this apparently was a newer bridge that was built in Dexter. And you can see that water is so close to the bottom. And even though it's not hitting the bridge proper, on those sides, you have to imagine that there is some impact to that infrastructure. So all of this stuff, as you guys know, costs money. So we have all these problems, and what can we do about them? So this is probably one of my favorite parts of my job, is to research different types of tools and resources and data that communities like yourself can use to help address and identify solutions to some of these problems. So the way I like to think about it is that there's really 5 steps. So exploring hazards and assessing vulnerabilities and risks. So when you're exploring hazards, we just talked about some of those. So like drought or flooding or ice jams. Windstorms is another big one that we didn't talk about today, but the potential for windstorms and the impacts of that. Then assessing vulnerabilities and risks. So once you have your hazard identified, then what things or what assets within your community are at risk or vulnerable from that? From there, you can start investigating options. So how can we make those assets less vulnerable or less at risk to that threat? And then from there, from those options, you prioritize which of those actions or strategies are highest priority for your community. And how you define priority is definitely, something that is on an individualized basis. Maybe it's something that dovetails with something else that you're already doing, so you can be strategic that way. Or maybe it's a priority because, an event happened and it was really catastrophic to your community. So it's raised that up to the top of the prioritization list. And from there, you're starting to plan, develop a plan of action, and then you take that action. So implement the plan. So we're talking about plan. Chris talked about planning, and I don't want to overlook the importance of planning and planning documents. I think that they are a fantastic tool for building resilience. You guys have a 9-element Black River watershed plan. Looking through that, I pulled out some of the priorities or how I interpreted some of the prioritized actions for municipal leaders. And I'll just quickly talk about a few of them. So intermunicipal agreements, I see that as kind of also shared services. So working with your neighbors, we talked a little bit about the Village of Copenhagen and how they relied on neighboring communities to help them in times of low water or water availability. So having agreements like that in place helps to take the burden off of each individual municipality, and also it allows municipalities and the people that are leading them to really play to their strengths. So for, Chris and I are presenting today, we're both strong in different areas. And so we have found that by presenting together, we can give you a more holistic and rounded presentation. Chris, you like how I tied that in there? Integrating resilience into regulatory framework. So if you're in the process of renewing your comprehensive plan or going through an LWRP, this might be a good time to think about how can you integrate some of these resiliency actions into your regulatory framework. And also collaborate. I can't mention this enough. So working with people that help provide you capacity, technical expertise, and experience. If you know of a neighboring community that did something that you think would work well in your community, reach out to them, find out how they did that, and learn from their experiences. So those 5 steps we talked about before, your watershed plan is helpful in all 5 of those aspects. So looking at a larger tool, so this is like a large repository, this US Climate Resiliency Toolkit. This is an online portal that has a ton of stuff. So here are some key features. One of the things I like most about this tool is the tutorial videos and also these case studies. I find those very useful, and I like the ability to search. So you can pick different aspects of your search. You can search by region or different things to identify tools that are helpful for you in your situation. The other thing is they're always looking for local stories. So if you in your community or a neighboring community, if someone has done something that you think is a good story that can be used as a case study, feel free. Chris and I are happy to be a liaison to help get that information packaged into case studies to have shared in tools like this. So this is something that I think is probably best used in the first 4 steps. And here's the web link. So as Katie and Michelle mentioned, this will be available to you after. Something that's available at the state level. So this is the New York State Climate Change Science Clearinghouse. This has a ton of data driving it. I really like to focus on this interactive mapping feature. And with that, you can really look at projected climate trends at the county level. So it's really a fantastic tool. Again, it's web-based. It provides a ton of stuff for you, including other websites that are of relevance. It's split out in different sectors, so it can really focus on ag. It can focus on other types of ecosystems. It's definitely helpful for the first 4 steps. The URL is there, and I think this is a really helpful resource to folks. Vulnerability assessments are things that you could use primarily in that second step, but they are useful for other steps as well. This is something that you can use for your community it's a checklist to look through and identify what those assets are and what the vulnerabilities are. This is one that Sea Grant and Partners put together a few years ago. It's called the New York's Great Lakes Coastal Resilience Index, but it is applicable to other regions outside of the Great Lakes proper. What I wanted to highlight here is that these are the sectors of the community that you can actually measure resilience or vulnerability, however you want to look at it. And I will talk about how you can customize it in a second. But each one of those sectors has their own grid like this. And what you do is look at what we call benchmark, and then a bad scenario, and then also like an even badder scenario. And then you look at, in this column all the way over to the right, how does your community respond after that scenario? You add all of these things up for each sector, and you end up with these points. And then that's how you figure out what your resilience index is for each sector. And then you add them up for the total, and then you interpret your results. This is not meant to save the world. This is meant to be a cheap, inexpensive, and easy way to get that initial baseline. And from that, you might find that there's one sector in the community or a specific component of a sector that's highly vulnerable. That's where you may decide to focus more resources, whether it be funding, time, expertise. You can customize this. So we have, you could either look at the threat of coastal flooding, so our Lake Ontario folks, but then also these other types of weather events. And this was done with a steering committee, and our communities and steering committee members identified these weather disasters as the types of events that they were most interested in exploring. For each of them, we have this chart. So National Weather Service and the Northeast Regional Climate Center and I work together to collect, to package data for each of these events. And you'll notice that you have a benchmark event. So each of them has a benchmark that's actually happened in the central, western, northern section of New York. So not downstate where we all live. And in addition to having this information in a chart form, they all have stories about them. So some people relate better to hearing how these areas were impacted during these events, and other people respond better to the chart, the information being shared in the chart. So that's how you can customize that, and you could use it for any of those weather events.
One thing I might add, these are great planning tools, but Mary wasn't suggesting this at all, but you don't want to take each of these events in a vacuum, right? Because there is something that's essentially called the shifting baseline, where one event knocks you back, and then you start to rebuild back to normal, and then another event knocks you back. It's like taking one step forward, 2 steps back. And we're experiencing this, globally, but certainly in places like Florida, the Panhandle that's been hit hard, Louisiana, where they never fully recover, and then they get hit again. And so you have to keep shifting your expectations for where you're going. Sorry, Mary. Thanks.
No, that's cool. Thanks. Oh, except now I just went right past it. Another tool is this community resilience building process. So this is an actual facilitation process. And I am one of those people that I see something and I love things about elements about everything, but I never seem to love one thing completely. So then what I like to do is mash them all up and customize them. So this is one of those types of processes that allows you to do that. But what it really does is include this huge public engagement component. I am a huge supporter of engaging the people that need these things or are asking for these things along throughout the entire process. And this is one way to really do that. If anyone is interested in this, and we'll talk about this in a case study in a minute, but this is a fantastic process and I would be happy to share experiences about that. Case studies are so important. I hear all the time. So I work with communities in New York's Great Lakes Basin. So that's a huge region. I hear all the time community leaders saying, boy, I wish I knew someone that did X, Y, Z. And then I hear it in the opposite end of the region, the same kinds of things. And so trying to marry those communities up so they can learn from each other. So one of the goals I have for myself is to start writing these up. If people have case studies, please let me know about them. I would love to help showcase those, but people learn from what others do. So what did you do? How did you do it? Who worked with you? Where did it happen? So if you find a case study that you think is really interesting, but you find out it's from like Oregon, that's okay. I'm sure there are elements from there that can be transferred and applied to your local issue and need. So I'm going to give you a local example, and then we're going to talk about some local-ish examples. So the first one is Dadville Creek. And so many of you probably know this much better than I do, but Nichelle told us about this and I thought it was amazing. So, and Nichelle, if I get anything incorrect, please correct me. So,
Mary, it is the Black River, but it's the Dadville Bridge.
Okay, thank you. See, I'm already wrong. So Dr. Harry O'Connor was a large animal vet, and he was unofficially, he was monitoring the river. And when he would do this, he was really doing it from the lens of notifying people of flooding, primarily as a way to protect their livestock because he was a large animal vet. He passed in 2014, and there happened to be a flood that same year. And so from that, it was really identified, okay, this is a huge problem. We need to take care of this. And so this is something that Nichelle's team at Lewis County Soil and Water, the USGS and the National Weather Service team together to install gauges and start doing this more extensive monitoring to help with flood risk there and get notification out when necessary. Nichelle, do you want to add anything about that? Because I think it's a really great example.
I do want to add the local, the county planning department and legislature was very supportive of purchasing gauges for these, monitoring, so that somebody was keeping an eye on these on the water levels, because we're experiencing more extreme events and more extreme, quicker flooding events. So this whole stream gauge monitoring system was really essential in keeping an eye on the river.
Awesome. So here we heard about monitoring. So some people might not think of that initially as a good step in resiliency, but if you're not getting this baseline data and you're not monitoring areas that are high risk, then how can you respond? So Nichelle, thanks for sharing that with us, and thanks for being on the spot. Another case study happened here in Wayne County, where I'm located, with the village of Sodas Point. So this one is about post-disaster recovery planning. In this case, it was post-flood recovery planning. And just for those who may not be aware of where this is, here's Wayne County and here is Sodas Point, and this is what the municipality looks like. So you can see it as a water loving municipality. We had catastrophic flooding in 2017 and 2019. As a result of the 2017 flooding, we went through, with partners, went through this post-flood recovery planning effort. And the purpose of that is exactly what Chris was talking about. So instead of building back what we know, which is what research tells us that we do, it's giving us time to actually stop, pause, and think about, if we rebuild, how do we rebuild better? How do we rebuild smarter? And how do we want to strategically attack what we need to rebuild? So you can see here, it was pretty inundated in all areas. So this is like their business district here. So we had flood survey data that we used to see where the impacts were. We used that coastal resilience index. So this is what one of those completed tables look like. We used that community resilience, we customized the community resilience building process. And this is what we did. We had this huge workshop with different breakout groups focusing on different sectors of the community. They had all these materials. I'm really hands-on. So like having these huge maps so people could like draw all over them, having these nice charts so they could identify what those assets were, who owned them, how did they function, were they at risk, did they function well or poorly, and then how could the functionality be improved? From there, we used sticky dots to prioritize. So we voted for those actions or vulnerabilities that people thought were the priorities. And from there, my partner and I put together a list of resiliency actions. We prioritized at the workshop, but then also with the planning board, because we also did not want to focus on actions that weren't as high of a priority for the municipality, because for them to enact these moving forward, we wanted to make sure that we had their interest. And with that, I will turn it over to Chris.
Thanks. So just one more case study. And this is a picture of Lourdes Hospital in Binghamton. So this is flooding, inundation. It's riverine flooding and along the Susquehanna River. And I want to point out in some ways a difference, and it's not better or worse or good or bad. It's just different. The response of the private sector versus the public sector. So this is a picture of Lourdes Hospital in 2011 after significant flooding. You'll notice that they have a seawall that's protecting the entire hospital that they built after the flooding in 2005 and 2006. So within 5 years, Lourdes Hospital realized, wow, we're vulnerable. And this whole community is vulnerable because in the first flooding in 2005, the hospital was shut down for a week. That's not a good place to be when you're one of three hospitals in a municipality, or one of three hospitals in a municipality. Everybody becomes vulnerable then. So within 5 years, they developed a plan. They looked at where they were vulnerable. They looked at solutions, and then they implemented one. And this seawall went up earlier in 2011. So they tested out their new seawall within months of finishing the construction. Now, what's behind this seawall, what's under this water, is their parking lot. The entire hospital and the parking lot were all built in the floodplain. This is something that these days we would hope that our local code enforcement officers and water floodplain managers would look at a little more closely than in decades past. Mary? So then flipping a little bit to the public sector, the Binghamton-Johnson City Joint Sewage Treatment Plant suffered catastrophic damage in the early double aughts flooding. And you can click to the next slide, Mary. And they lost a whole portion of their tanks, fell over into the creek, again, adjacent to the Susquehanna River. This is just downstream from the hospital that I just showed you. And construction on this plant is still ongoing. So it's been 15 years. a price tag of 170 million. That the price tag keeps going up. I think it's pushing 300 million at this point, and the plant's still not fully functional. And they're talking about potentially privatizing this treatment plant, which certainly has its pros and cons. It's not a conversation to have today, but again, looking at how you plan and prepare, look at your vulnerabilities and move forward. And sometimes we get to be our own worst enemy in that process. Mary? Just another picture of the devastation, kind of disaster tourism, if you will, of the sewage treatment plant. Next slide, Mary. And so after the floods in 2005, 2006, Binghamton and Broome County were like, wow, we really need to create a plan. And so this is a snapshot of their revised comprehensive plan, which has a whole chapter on flooding and flood resiliency and recommendations and plans for implementing protections for the city of Binghamton. But it took those repeated disasters for them to create a plan. So going back to my much earlier point about proactive planning versus reactive planning, you definitely want to be on the proactive side. Mary? So I think we have another poll for you. And so over the last 5 years, has your community suffered impacts from a weather event? If yes, did it disrupt the economy, functionality of the municipal staff, left longstanding impacts to the community, or required assistance from outside the municipality, i.e. county, state, or federal? So that poll is open. Please go ahead and vote. I'd say vote early and vote often, but I don't think you can vote often in this one. So if you will take we'll keep it open for a couple more seconds, and then we'll end the poll and see how folks' responses are. All right, we'll close the poll in 3, 2, 1. There we are. So 67% of you, excuse me, said yes, you have suffered from a severe weather event. And about half of those who said yes said it did require external assistance. Now, it's not a bad thing to need or ask for external assistance, but that becomes another layer of complication that you probably would like to avoid. Sure, money from the state could be helpful, but that often comes with other strings attached. So being able to be resilient, again, being able to take care of yourself to the highest degree possible is not a bad place to be. Mary, next. So this is another, now I'm going to talk about some funding for resiliency planning, for resiliency implementation. Now this is another picture of downtown Binghamton. The plywood clad building to the far right of this picture is actually Binghamton University's new downtown development that they were building at the time of the flood. And you can see all the construction debris floating around, and the Susquehanna River proper is to the left of the screen. Mary, yep. So you can't necessarily buy resilience or resiliency. There's not like a resiliency fund out there. Again, some of the examples that we shared in our case studies, some of the other things we've been talking about, resilience means different things to different people. It may be drought that's your vulnerability when you have wells that dry up. It may be riverine flooding or coastal inundation. And so then you have other issues with sewer or businesses and homes being flooded. So looking at what it is that you need, and then you start looking for the type of funding that's appropriate for it. So it could be infrastructure upgrades, it could be planning, community planning, infrastructure and utility planning. Building capacity, maybe hiring a full-time code enforcement officer who can also do the required part of the job, which is also serving as a floodplain manager, having that additional capacity to be able to better manage in cases of flooding. And then also economic development, improving your infrastructure. Some of the pictures that we saw, this is quality of life. When wells dry up, businesses don't want to invest. When wells dry up, people think about moving to a part of town or another town that has a public water, so they don't have to worry about that happening to them again. Next slide. And you can do that through, you can pay for resiliency through looking at the Regional Economic Development Council. If you haven't heard of the Regional Economic Development Councils, I'll encourage you to please take a look. There'll be a link on a subsequent slide. They have the consolidated funding application, which is a little bit different now because of COVID, but in the recent past, it would be essentially the portal to just about every type of New York State funding program possible, including the climate smart communities, where you can do both planning and implementation, and the DEC engineering planning grants. So if you're looking at water or wastewater infrastructure improvement, but you're not quite sure what you need, they can give you a grant to create that engineering plan. Mary? Some other popular funding programs, I'm sorry, I should have typed these all out. ESD, all the acronyms. ESD, Empire State Development, they offer grants for infrastructure investments. Again, a topic for another conversation, but infrastructure is economic development, right? It's not only jobs for the people who come, it's also ensuring for people who want to develop, either residents with homes or businesses, that there's sufficient infrastructure that they can rely on so that their business can thrive. So anyway, Empire State Development, infrastructure investments, economic investments, you can get up to about 25% of the total project costs. Now, a lot of these projects you would what we call co-fund, and they do it all the time with state funding programs, where you can get a little bit of money from DEC, a little bit of money from HCR, a little bit of money from Empire State Development, to essentially get almost to 100% funded across different funding programs with similar interests. And so Empire State Development also funds strategic planning studies. Again, this is part of resiliency planning. Where are we going from here, and what do we need to get there? HCR, Housing and Community Renewal. This is the Community Development Block Grant. They fund infrastructure and facilities and planning. Again, getting some free planning money to figure out what it is where you want to go and how to get there. The New York Main Street program, this is really focused for like your downtown, your Four Corners, that one dense part of town that you may want to do some renovations or technical assistance. It's a little bit off of the resiliency topic, but it may help you also with infrastructure improvement and resiliency to extreme storms should your infrastructure already not quite be where it needs to be. And then finally, for this slide, New York State Department of State Local Waterfront Revitalization Program. So if you have a waterfront, and it doesn't have to be on Lake Ontario, it could be the Black River. It doesn't have to be a beach, it can be a park. You can develop a plan for how to use that waterfront or reuse it or revitalize it, how to make it sustainable, resilient, and they'll get, so it's a two-step program. A lot of these are two-step programs. They'll give you money to create a plan, and then if they like your plan enough, they'll give you money to implement that plan. Also the Canalway grants, I won't get into those because you guys are not on the Erie Canal, I don't think. And then local government efficiency. So looking at capacity development, again, with your town or village staff, how you can get money from the Department of State to look at your municipality's operations and see if there's a way, and this isn't like, looking at bad actors, so to speak, or certain employees or whatever. This is looking at a way for you to do more with less. Next slide, thanks. Ag and markets, again, looking at your agricultural districts. They have planning grants to create a district or to revise a plan for a district if you already have a plan. And then the Environmental Facilities Corporation. This is essentially New York State's infrastructure bank. They have, again, the wastewater engineering planning grant. They'll give you $30,000 for a planning study. You'll only have to come up with 7,500 of your own. And again, two-step process. They fund the plan, and then they will fund the implementation of the plan in the second step. Water, the WQIP, again, sorry for the acronym, Water Quality Implementation Program. So this funds local water and quality improvements, which could mean covered salt barns. This could mean riparian improvements. This could mean stormwater, better stormwater management, wastewater infrastructure upgrades, and the like. And then finally on this slide, the Green Innovation Grant Program. This is stormwater management, better stormwater management. And the cool thing here is it's 90% of the total project is funded through a grant. A lot of funding programs are loans. Some of these here I'm talking about are grants, and this is a really well-funded program for stormwater management. So when you look at some of your flooding, be it riverine or whatever, where are the ways you can slow the water down, spread it out, soak it up, build in redundancy to slow down that stormwater, to reduce the volume and the velocity that creates such havoc. This is a program where you could look at getting funding to do that. And then this is a federal program, but they do co-funding with some of the state programs. USDA Rural Development, I'm sure pretty much all of you probably are in a population of 10,000 or less where you'd be applicable for their funds. Primarily looking at water, wastewater, and stormwater, I need to add that. Infrastructure funding through loans or principal forgiveness, or zero interest loans. And it's a topic for an entirely different day, but again, you know, a no interest loan is still cheap, right? Imagine getting a mortgage for your house at no interest, right? So people often spend a lot of time chasing down grants because they think it's free money. Grants often come with a whole lot of strings attached, where you're required to do reporting, where you're required to follow certain regulations and rules and expectations, and documenting things that sometimes the loans are a lot less burdensome from an administrative perspective. And if it's a 1% loan or a 0% loan, you're saving millions of dollars over the life of that loan, just by not having interest. I mean, this is a different way to frame the message, a loan versus grants. Thanks, Mary. So regional economic development councils, here's the website, regionalcouncils.ny.gov. Mary, would you mind dropping that into the chat, just so people can click on it more readily? You'll see that most of you are in the North Country, probably some in the Mohawk Valley. I'd recommend when you go into that website, take a look at your specific region, look at who's on the committee. Chances are you know somebody who knows somebody who is, and look at what the goals are for your regional council. What are the kinds of things that they fund? Where are they funding projects? It'll give you an idea of how, excuse me, it'll give you an idea of how you need to approach these state funding programs with any of the ideas, any of the project ideas you may have. And the reason I bring this up, Mary, next slide, please. And thank you for dropping that in, is that every project that you submit to the state is essentially rated on a 100-point scale. And the first 20 points of your project's the first 20 points for your project comes from the local regional economic development council. So you want to make sure it's aligned with their goals and priorities. You're also going to want to make sure you've sent it to them ahead of time so they know it's coming. They can give you some preliminary advice, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide. So I think this is where I kick it back to Mary.
Thanks, Chris. So while Chris is taking a break with his voice, we just wanted to leave you with a couple of thoughts about, you know, we've covered a lot of ground today, and just some ideas about what can you do once you are either back at your office or back at your computer. So some inexpensive and less challenging paths to move forward. So some kind of self-assessment, whether it's a formalized document or even just inventorying what kind of plans you have and identifying where there might be some area to call out some resiliency actions there. Again, look at what others have done, learn lessons from others. I mean, steal things with permission, right? So rather than recreating the wheel, learn from others' experiences. And the next one, checking out those broad application tools. So, you know, when we're talking about the tools and some of those things that can work for all 5 of those steps. So like those big web portals, you know, if you're looking for case studies or even just spending some time looking through those and seeing what those tools have to offer. And there are a ton of other tools. If you just click in or type in like Resiliency Toolkit into your browser, other things will come up too. Talk to other people that you know are struggling with either similar issues or ones that you know that have been working on ways to improve their preparedness and responsiveness to some of these issues, and reach out to experts. So people that either have this information, so reaching out to Chris and I to help either respond to or provide information, support, also helping to make connections to other folks. So building your capacity by leaning on others, I think, are great ways to start. Chris, I don't know if there are other things you want to add to that.
I would say just know that you're not alone, and also know that some of the most enriching experiences I've had with local elected officials is being in a room with a bunch of people, going around the circle and asking folks, who are you, where are you from, and what are your major concerns? And there's so many common threads in those concerns that's what people like me and Mary and Michelle and Katie, that's what we do for our jobs, is help folks get over some of those challenges and obstacles. But just know that it's not you, you're not alone, and sometimes it's really gratifying to hear from other folks how they work through some of the challenges that they have.
I think that's it for us. Yep.
Okay, thank you, Mary and Chris. Thank you very much. We have some time for questions. I didn't see any in the chat yet, so I'll give you just a few minutes to include that in the chat. But my question is, I know our county has gone through the hazard mitigation plan and passed that. How would you say that fits into the climate resiliency, model?
One of the things that we've been seeing in other regions is that some prior county hazard mitigation plans didn't use climate projections, but I think a lot of the counties have been changing that. And so hopefully that's one of the things that was done. But one of the things to do is look at that and identify, because it prioritizes the threats, right? And so looking at that and helping to identify, do we have plans for these threats at the local level? Are there ways that we could be doing things to support some of the actions that are identified in there?
Okay, thank you. Katie, did you see any other questions? Okay, I want to make sure I'm double checking. Okay. So at this point, if nobody else has any other questions, please remember there's going to be, you can go back to this on YouTube. Thank you so much to Mary and Chris for presenting today. I've always enjoyed your presentations. Thank you everyone on the call who's actually shown the interest in the Black River watershed and climate resiliency. We certainly appreciate your feedback and appreciate your attention today. We hope you'll join us for upcoming webinars. I think we had a link in the very beginning to the upcoming Zooms that we'll have. And take a few seconds, if you could, to leave some comments. We always look back at these comments and help for future conference topics. Our next presentation that will be coming up will be on June 9th, Watershed Wednesday. We'll have our very own Assistant State Director for Soil and Water Conservation District and some panelists from the 5 districts that are in the Black River Watershed to talk about how districts can help communities and municipalities. Katie, did you have anything else to add?
No, just thank you again to Mary and Chris for taking the time to do this. I hope you guys shared a lot of information, a lot of links. So I hope people take time. If you want to send me the slide deck too, I will send that back out when I send an email to all the participants with the link to the YouTube as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.
That concludes our presentation.